Cellular respiration is a three-stage process. The ultimate goal is to make ATP, adenosine triphosphate, by converting it from ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate. So the first stage of glycolysis is called glycolysis. It takes place in the cytoplasm, just outside the mitochondria, which we'll talk about. And this first stage is referred to as anaerobic. That means it's without oxygen, O2. In the first stage of glycolysis, we take in food molecules. Now, we can make energy from a variety of different food molecules, but for most of this conversation, we are just going to focus in on talking about glucose. And glucose has a formula C6H12O6. That's supposed to be a bracket. Now, we're going to be following the carbons because that explains why we breathe out carbon dioxide. Again, the whole point is to produce ATP, not CO2. So CO2 is referred to as a byproduct. It's not the main thing that's being produced, but it is a product that's necessary in order to drive the ATP production. Now, what happens to glucose is that we split it into smaller bits. And we split it into a 3-carbon molecule called pyruvate. We make 2 of those. Now, there are other chemicals involved in this, but it's not necessary to discuss that at this time. What we're trying to show is that the first stage of glycolysis ends with the production of pyruvate. And then we get into the second stage. Now, when glucose is broken down into pyruvate, ultimately, we make a little bit of ATP. So we go from an energy-poor molecule of adenosine diphosphate to an energy-rich molecule of adenosine triphosphate. Now, ATP is involved in everything, every reaction, every build, every breakdown. It is the main chemical molecule of life. So this reaction is taking glucose to pyruvate. So that requires some energy. And so we show that as a double arrow, changing a little bit of ATP back into ADP. Now, the good news is when we break glucose into pyruvate, we actually make a little more ATP than what we use up. We net gain 2 more molecules of ATP than what is used. I think 4 is actually made in total and 2 is used up, and so we get a net gain of 2. So that's what that means. Now, during this time, we also convert NAD into a molecule called NADH2. Now, we're not going to learn the long names of these molecules because it's not that important. What I need you to know is that it's grabbing onto those hydrogens. It is those energy-rich hydrogen electrons that we will grab to use to the last stage. Now, the second stage of cellular respiration is called the Krebs cycle. And it has other names. It also has the Krebs citric acid cycle, but for our purposes, we'll just leave it as a Krebs cycle. Now, this takes place, and you'll see this blank is long here. This takes place, the second and third stage, in the mitochondria. which has always been referred to as the powerhouse of the cell. And it's the powerhouse of the cells because that's where most of our ATP is actually produced. Now, both the second and third stage are referred to as aerobic. That means it needs oxygen. And we'll talk about why it needs oxygen here in a little bit. So now that we have the Krebs cycle, so the Krebs cycle is everything between these dashed lines here. And then the last stage will happen on the other side. But we'll look at what happens to pyruvate. Pyruvate, if there's oxygen present, will be converted into a new molecule called acetyl-CoA, which has 2-carbon compound, which is a 2-carbon compound. Now that only happens, so we had a 3-carbon go to a 2-carbon. So where did the other carbon go? Well, this is why it is an aerobic process, which means there has to be oxygen present there. If there's oxygen present there, that extra carbon leaves as CO2. So there's the carbon that we were talking about, and this is why it's aerobic, because we need that oxygen. The oxygen combines with the carbon in order to go from a large 3-carbon to a 2-carbon molecule. That 2-carbon acetyl-CoAs will combine with a 4-carbon compound to produce a 6-carbon compound. And that 6-carbon compound is actually a citric acid, which is similar to acids found in oranges and such. Now that 6-carbon turns into a 5-carbon compound. Now where did the carbon go? Well, the carbon left as CO2, as long as there's oxygen present. That 5-carbon will turn back into a 4-carbon as long as oxygen is present. It'll leave it as carbon dioxide. So every time you reduce the size of a carbon compound, you remove it with the oxygen that's present to produce carbon dioxide. Ultimately, the important part is right at the very start. Now, if we don't have that oxygen present, we've probably felt this, and we don't produce acetyl-CoAs, we produce lactic acid. And we'll talk about anaerobic respiration a little later on. Now, this cycle of 4 plus 2 gives us 6 to a 5, and then back to a 4, plus the 2 gives a 6, 5, 4. That's where the cycle comes from. And every turn of the cycle produces things for us. So the key thing that it's producing is our energy molecule of ATP. So we're converting energy poor molecule into an energy-rich molecule on every turn of this cycle. Now, because this turn of the cycle is a series of reactions, it actually requires energy. And so we have another arrow going back, well, we put some energy as ATP in, and what we get out is ADP. Now, the good news is we produce more ATP than what we're using. We produce a net gain of 2. At the same time, we convert NAD into NADH2. Again, we are grabbing the free electron that is occurring because of this cycle. And we also have another, and they're referred to as coenzymes, FAD. Now, if you want, you can go search up the names of NAD and FAD, but I do not require what those names are. That FAD will also grab onto hydrogen to form FADH2. So we're grabbing onto all these hydrogen electrons as much as we can. The cycle produces a little bit of energy, but now comes the last stage. The last stage is referred to as the electron transport chain, also known as ETC. Now, I do expect you to know what it stands for, but if you want to use ETC instead of saying electron transport chain, that would be fine. Now, those electrons that we just were grabbing in both the glycolysis and the Krebs cycle are here. I'm just going to rewrite them. NADPH2 and FADH2. They offload the hydrogens to form, back again, NAD. Oh, I made a mistake. It's not NADP. We're going to be talking about that in a second. NADH2 and FADH2. The FADH2 offloads their hydrogen to form FAD. So those hydrogens, I'm going to write hydrogen electrons here, are dumped into a series of reactions, and they're actually called redox reactions, reduction-oxidation reactions. We're not going to get into that, but they offload those electrons. And what happens in a whole pile of series of reactions, energy levels, is that it converts a whole pile of ADP, oh my goodness, my P, ADP into ATP. Now, because this is a series of reactions, it also requires energy, so we need to put our arrow back the other way as well. Now, the nice thing is, this produces a net gain of 32 ATP molecules, way more than both the first and the second stage. And at the end, when you combine hydrogen and oxygen, because this is aerobic, we produce a good byproduct, water.